Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly.
Corruption is a cancer. Those of you who watch Superman movies and comic books, it is like kryptonite to the functioning of democracy. It affronts the dignity of your people. Fighting corruption may not be easy. It's hard, but not a mystery. Transparency, disclosure, and the freedom to investigate abuses.
Hello, I am Olivier Berruyer, founder of the website L'Ecris.fr, one of the most important websites about geopolitics in France, covering international relations, economy and media criticism. For what has now been a few years, we have specialized in the analysis of proxy international conflicts between Russia and the United States. For example, neocon propaganda on matters of American foreign affairs, or the unstated Russian support to Donbas separatists in the east of Ukraine. After having thoroughly analyzed the 2014 Ukrainian revolution and its consequences in more than 400 articles, and considering the burning topicality in the United States, we have decided to carry out an independent investigation on the Ukraine Gate, in particular to point out the issue of the quality of information on the other side of the Atlantic. As we just saw, Joe Biden regularly denounces the scourge of corruption, yet we're about to show you that his own attitude on the subject is quite suspicious. And we will demonstrate that he has lied several times, an attitude that threatens to become his own kryptonite. But let's begin with the first overview explaining the roots of this story. The Donald Trump impeachment story starts with a simple phone conversation. On the 25th of July 2019, the President of the United States calls a new Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. During the conversation, Trump told his counterpart, "I would like you to do us a favor. There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great." Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. The discussion occurred at a moment when Joe Biden ranked favorite against Trump in the polls for the 2020 presidential elections. Donald Trump did not ask Zelensky for any compensation during that conversation, but some have noticed that 2 weeks earlier he had suspended $391 million in American military aid to Ukraine and believe that the move was actually intended to give him leverage.
When you have a new president of Ukraine who is hearing from the United States of America that his aid is being cut off and that he has an outstanding request to do the president's political bidding, it is, of course, common sense that he, especially as a political novice, representing a country very dependent on the United States, would connect the two.
Trump answered by saying the suspension arose from fears that the money would not be used appropriately, considering the high levels of corruption in Ukraine.
Frankly, Ukraine, we want to help them. And I do like the new president. You know why I like him? Because he was honest. Because he said there was no pressure at all exerted on me, meaning him, by the president of the United States.
На мене ніхто не може тиснути, тому що я президент незалежної країни.
Ukraine is known before him for tremendous corruption. Tremendous. More than just about any country in the world. In fact, they're rated one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
Indeed, in 2017, Ernst & Young ranked Ukraine as the most corrupt country among all those it assessed.
And I don't like giving money to a country that's that corrupt. But I gave the money because Rob Portman and others called me and asked. But I don't like to be the sucker.
On the one hand, the Democrats criticized Trump for having exerted pressure on President Zelensky in order to harm Joe Biden's candidacy. But on the other hand, Trump blames Joe Biden for having exerted pressure on Ukraine for personal reasons in relation to this man. At the heart of the Ukraine gate is this man, Mykola Zlochevsky. This 53-year-old Ukrainian oligarch is a former engineer and became a hydrocarbon trader. He then created in 2002 a gas extraction company in Ukraine called Burisma. On 2 occasions, this industrialist has held senior positions in the Ukrainian government, leading gas licensing first from 2003 to 2005 and then from 2010 to 2012 as Minister of Natural Resources. As might be expected in one of the most corrupt countries in the world, he has benefited greatly from his position by granting licenses to Burisma without a call for tenders. Several people said they met with the oligarch minister to discuss his company's investments, sometimes even in his office in the department. Thus, at the end of his ministerial functions, Burisma had become the largest private gas producer in Ukraine. But then came the demonstrations of the winter of 2013-2014, initially peaceful and joyful, before turning into the Euromaidan revolution on the 20th of February 2014, which led to the president's flight. This brutal change of regime directly threatened the oligarchs linked to the former power, and in particular Mykola Zlochevsky. Close to the deposed president whose party he financed, this oligarch alone was a symbol of the corruption of the former regime. This could make him a target for the new government. Thus, barely a month after the revolution, the former minister was targeted by an investigation for money laundering, and a court decision froze his accounts in England. At that time, he was in danger of losing $23 million. Under attack from all sides, Zlochevsky's situation seemed desperate, but our billionaire oligarch has more than one trick and a dollar in his bag. And indeed, the solution was not so complicated.
Hunter Biden has been appointed head of legal affairs at Burisma Holdings, Ukraine's largest private gas producer. The U.S. Vice President's son will also join the company's board of directors, consulting on matters related to international expansion and policies surrounding the country's economy.
And I'm joined by Peter Schweitzer, president of the Government Accountability Institute, co-author of Secret Empires and host of a new investigative series called The Drill Down.
In the case of the Ukraine, Hunter Biden joins the board of Burisma, a troubled energy company in Ukraine, in the spring of 2014. It's important for people to know that he had no background in Ukraine. He had no background in energy policy. What I think he had was a father who was point person in the Obama administration on U.S. aid dollars flowing to Ukraine. Basically, we know from financial records that Hunter Biden was getting $83,000 a month from Burisma. The problem is that corruption is being globalized. And what that means is that foreign governments and foreign oligarchs are looking to recruit the family members of politicians because they believe by striking commercial bargains with them, helping politician families become rich, that they're going to get favorable treatment.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Burisma?
I don't know. Probably not. I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
Senior elected officials have to remove all conflicts between their business interests and their government responsibilities. Every other democracy in the world, that system pertains.
Or not. This is debatable. Well, after sharing the message of salvation in his sermon, Joe Biden reminded us of this.
As the Prime Minister and the President have heard me often say, I never tell another man or another nation or another woman what's in their interest.
Thus, Joe Biden claims to hold as his guiding principle to never interfere in another country's affairs. We'd very much like to believe him, but it's not true.
Ukraine has taken bold steps toward a new anti-corruption bureau and has passed legislation to reform the Prosecutor General's office. It has to be implemented now.
Joe Biden was particularly concerned with anything relating to the Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office, to the point where he directly targeted the institution, and in doing so, it triggered the Ukraine Gate. Simply put, the Prosecutor General office is the equivalent of our prosecution service, but with even greater jurisdiction. It is responsible with initiating legal actions and ensures the legality of investigations. It's headed by the Prosecutor General, who is nominated by the President for a period of 6 years. However, 5 prosecutors have succeeded one another since the 2014 revolution, and among them very few were renowned for their integrity. The first one filled the position temporarily. He immediately opened several criminal investigations against Mykola Zlochevsky on the basis of corruption and money embezzlement, but he only stayed in office for 4 months. The second prosecutor general was Vitaly Yarema, appointed by President Petro Poroshenko after his election in June 2014. At the end of his nomination, Yarema seemed to be well-intentioned.
Корупція і інші негативні явища, які вразили не тільки прокуратуру, і всі правоохоронні органи. Хто зі мною, будь ласка, становимо строй і разом працюємо. Хто проти, будемо вирішувати питання і в установленому законом порядку прощатися.
However, Yarema's reputation was quickly tarnished by an international scandal in connection with Mykola Zlochevsky. At the time, US Ambassador to Ukraine, Geoffrey Payat, had even talked about it publicly in one of his speeches.
There is one glaring problem that threatens all of the good work. That obstacle is the failure of the institution of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to successfully fight internal corruption. For example, in the case of former Ecology Minister Mykola Zlochevsky, UK authorities seized $23 million in illicit assets that belong to the Ukrainian people. Officials at the PGO's office were asked by the UK to send documents supporting the seizure. Instead, they sent letters to Zlochevsky's attorneys attesting that there was no case against him. And as a result, the money was freed by the UK court, and shortly thereafter, $23 million of the Ukrainian people's money moved to accounts in Cyprus.
Hence, Prosecutor Yarema's bureau drafted a document which allowed Zlochevsky to retrieve the 23 million seized by London. Should we simply see it as a mistake? In order to know, we dug up this 2015 news archive in which Deputy Prosecutor General Sagvarelidze, freshly appointed, revealed the following information.
По одному делу, например, по бывшему министру экологии, интересовались причиной, почему отсюда не были, значит, не отправлены качественные материалы по этому делу и сняли санкции. В Британии конкретно один из руководящих должностных лиц прокуратуры ему объявил, что у них подозрение, что якобы один из следователей взял взятку там, в сумме $7 миллионов. Ну, это, конечно же, стыдно. Это не должно быть. Такие люди не должны представлять лицо этого государства, нашего государства, и, конечно же, должны быть приняты конкретные меры.
Obviously, after such a scandal, Prosecutor General Yarema had no choice but to resign.
Хотів перш за все констатувати вже після вашого голосування, що тепер уже колишній генеральний прокурор Віталій Ярема коли він написав заяву про відставку, ті, хто задіяний в корупційних оборудках, мають бути негайно притягнуті до відповідальності.
And that is how a new Prosecutor General eventually was chosen, Viktor Shokin, brought back from retirement for this occasion.
Я знаю Віктора Миколаївича вже, думаю, що більше 15 років, і його професійний досвід і добра репутація стали головними чинниками, які визначили мій вибір.
Here is how Shokin was portrayed in the press at the moment of his nomination, knowing that he was already well known after having spent his entire career in this institution. At that time, several experts interviewed by the BBC said that Viktor Shokin was professional and competent. He was said to be a high-level specialist, removed from political preferences. Shokin could boast success in high-profile criminal cases. He was said to be a particularly efficient Ukrainian prosecutor. Hence, it's not without reasons that he was called back into office. And in the end, his track record is not that bad. After his first year in office, the activity of Prosecutor Shokin's bureau was assessed. As you can see, Shokin appears to be 2 or 3 times as efficient as his predecessors, whether it be in terms of the amount of money recovered, of the number of criminal investigations initiated, or of the number of anti-corruption actions launched against public servants. Similarly, in 2015, the press reported numerous anti-corruption procedures launched by the Prosecutor's Bureau. But Shokin's crown achievement is the creation of an anti-corruption prosecutor bureau as an independent entity. Viktor Shokin also managed to catch a member of parliament engaging in an act of corruption. He then broadcasted the hidden camera footage to the whole parliament, including the incriminated MP. Take a look.
Генеральною прокуратурою України розслідується кримінальне провадження за фактами вчинення тяжких та особливо тяжких злочинів одним із народних депутатів України. Прошу дуже уважно подивитися оцей фрагмент. Прошу фрагмент включити.
По кар'єру. Я тобі розказую. Значить, мінімум 100 тисяч гривень нести треба. Мінімум. Для отримання ліцензії. Чудово. Я тобі допомогу по кар'єрі. Я тебе прикрию, навіть якщо ти почнеш видобуток, але паралельно будеш робити документи. Прикрию і з міліції, і з СБУ, і все. Прокуратура не прикриє, поки. Оставався в ямку і з прокуратури прикрив.
Як балакали, 100 там, коротше. Ну, все, що, я кажу, все, що насаджу, то непосильним трудом, да.
Я сказав, що зроблю завтра, буквально вже буде все забере.
Наочно бачили самі, як формує своє майно, грошові кошти радикальна партія, котра йде на вибори. Їм грошей не вистачає.
A few minutes later, a vote from the MPs deprived Mosiciuk of his parliamentary immunity. He was then arrested after Shokin's inquiry. But this colorful radical MP got out of jail very quickly, because the parliament had not respected the official procedure for the removal of his immunity. Why is Mosiciuk still free? There were 2 problems. First, I was expecting, according to the procedure, that the MPs examine my proposition and then let Mosiciuk talk. But this is not how things went down. The proposition was immediately put to a vote. It surprised me. I don't know who decided of this hastiness or why, but it resulted in the invalidation of the procedure. And then, for a reason that I'm not aware of, Lutsenko gave up on the prosecution. There were still bribes, though, in addition to the ones I had identified in the parliament. There should have been more valuations, more confrontations, but for a reason I don't know, Lutsenko decided otherwise. What were his motivations, I don't know. However, fighting corruption is no easy job, in Ukraine as elsewhere. It can even turn into a high-risk occupation, as Shokin indicated several times by mentioning his own security.
Я став на шлях і стояв, і буду стояти на боротьбі з корупцією на всіх напрямках, без виключення. Я заважаю багатьом видобувати незаконно бурштин, пісок, заважаю іншим незаконним оборудкам. Я маю обґрунтовані підстави вважати, що мене хочуть знищити фізично. На жаль, це так.
On the 15th of October 2015, Shokin also stated the following. Not long ago, I've warned against a potential attempt on my life. I've said this after we had discovered an unloaded revolver hidden in our offices. It was thus decided to strengthen my security. Armored vehicle, fluctuating itineraries, and I stay in different apartments. Alas, the succession of events since then has proved that his fears were legitimate.
Вчера около 10 вечера во время служебного совещания Виктор Шокин и сотрудники, что сидели за столом, попали под обстрел снайпера.
Шокирующая весть о покушении на генерального прокурора Украины Виктора Шокина наделала немало шума во властных кабинетах. Ведь повод серьезный. Впервые в истории независимой Украины произошла попытка убийства чиновника высочайшего уровня. Дерзость заказчиков и исполнителей впечатляет. Стреляли в Шокина прямо во время совещания с прокурорами в его кабинете.
Генеральный прокурор это оценивает как месседж в его сторону о том, что мы можем.
В то же время покушение не то чтобы стало для украинцев неожиданностью, ведь ему предшествовал целый ряд этаких сигналов. В частности, еще в июле Шокин шокировал неожиданным заявлением. Говорил, его жизнь под угрозой.
Luckily, Shokin managed to escape unharmed. He later indicated that it was probably a warning. But in the end, his biggest problems did not come from Ukraine.
Hey folks, Joe Biden. I just got off a 8-9 hour flight from Washington to the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv.
It is because Joe Biden was a long-time member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that President Obama trusted him with the Ukrainian case. He then very closely followed the topic and visited Kyiv numerous times, notably in 2015, when he gave a speech to the parliament.
It's not enough to set up a new anti-corruption bureau and establish a special prosecutor fighting corruption. The Office of the General Prosecutor desperately needs reform.
We can clearly see that Joe Biden totally interferes with Ukraine's domestic affairs, and that he targets precisely the Prosecutor General's office. The press also reported that behind the scenes, Joe Biden had demanded the departure of Prosecutor Shokin as a condition of American financial support. Yet, Biden is always keen on declaring he does not want to interfere in foreign countries' affairs.
As the Prime Minister and the President have heard me often say, I never tell another man or another nation or another woman what's in their interest.
What a beautiful statement. The problem is that it's a lie, and Biden doesn't even try to hide it.
I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
So Joe Biden has directly interfered with Ukraine's domestic affairs by using blackmail methods. And this fact was indeed confirmed by his own advisor.
The sense was, not only in the U.S. government, but in the EU and the IMF, that Shokin had become kind of a single point of failure. Fast forward to December, Vice President Biden is traveling to Kyiv. So we're flying over to Kyiv, and we're talking about the speech, and we're talking about the loan guarantee, and the Vice President is getting briefed by his advisors, but also by Assistant Secretary Nuland, and then when we land, by Ambassador Pyatt. And the Vice President basically says, look, I'm just going to tell Poroshenko that you're not getting the money unless you fire Shokin. And the reason why the Vice President decided to make it that stark was that he believed we were never going to have the kind of leverage we had right now.
At the same time, I must point out that with a president like Barack Obama, Joe Biden was really well schooled.
We occasionally have to twist the arms of countries that wouldn't do what we need them to do if it weren't for the various economic or diplomatic or in some cases military leverage that we had.
Therefore, Joe Biden is blatantly lying when he asserts this.
I'm very concerned about foreign interference beyond me.
For several weeks, Shokin first has refused to resign, before Biden's pressure grew stronger, and President Poroshenko finally gave in.
Я звернувся до Віктора Миколайовича Шокіна з пропозицією, щоб він написав заяву про відставку. Віктор Шокін впровадив ті реформи, яким в ГПУ чинили спротив десятиліттями. Позбавлення прокуратури загального нагляду, створення Національного антикорупційного бюро і Державного бюро розслідувань тощо. Це з одного боку. А з іншого, Генеральна прокуратура України, на жаль, не змогла заручитися довірою суспільства.
In the first instance, Ukrainian MPs rejected Shokin's resignation. But a second vote then took place, and this time his resignation was accepted. A new prosecutor general was thereafter nominated, and if we believe Joe Biden,
And they put in place someone who was solid.
someone solid to take over from Shokin? But who is he talking of?
2 місяці пройшло з тих пір, який був відправлений у відставку Віктор Миколаївич Шокін. І ми не маємо можливості далі чекати. Подаю кандидатуру генерального прокурора, і цим генеральним прокурором буде Юрій Віталійович Луценко. Він за свої переконання пішов на ешафот. Він не зрадив своїм переконанням в'язниці.
Sorry?
Він не зрадив своїм переконанням в'язниці.
Indeed, Yuri Lutsenko was convicted in 2010 and sentenced to 4 years in jail for embezzlement and abuse of authority before being pardoned in 2013. Former Member of Parliament Alexander Onichenko reminded us of the reasons for his imprisonment.
But Lutsenko was in jail?
Lutsenko, yes, yeah, because that's why he was minister when he did a lot of stupid things, and he stole something from the budget of the Ministry of Interior, and then that's why he was in jail after. Yeah.
To get a clearer picture, we asked the new Ukrainian MP Rinat Kuzmin, who was Deputy Prosecutor General between 2006 and 2014, and he therefore headed the legal proceedings against Lutsenko.
Занималось управление, которым я руководил, Следственное управление Генеральной прокуратуры. Это дело о коррупции министра внутренних дел, который был осужден украинским судом за коррупцию. Суть обвинений Луценко в следующем. Луценко, будучи министром внутренних дел Украины, незаконно назначил своего личного водителя на работу в разведку. При этом, как было установлено следствием, водитель разведчиком не работал, а продолжал возить министра на служебном автомобиле. Кроме того, Луценко умышленно нарушил постановление правительства Украины, запрещавшее использовать государственные бюджетные средства на оплату различных увеселительных мероприятий, праздников и прочее. Кроме того, Луценко, будучи министром внутренних дел, разрешил проведение оперативно-технических мероприятий, а именно снятие информации с канала связи, прослушивание телефонных переговоров, использование других оперативных средств в отношении лица, не совершавшего никаких преступлений. После прихода к власти президента Порошенко Луценко был назначен генеральным прокурором Украины. Впервые за всю историю ее существования был назначен генеральным прокурором человек, мало того, что осужденный и отбывавший наказание в колонии за коррупцию. В Украине был назначен генеральным прокурором человек, не имевший вообще юридического образования. Как отреагировала юридическая общественность на такое назначение, несложно себе представить. Всем стало понятно, что начало краха правовой системы начнется как раз с этого назначения генерального прокурора Украины.
This is the man chosen to replace Shokin? Joe Biden was very clear, though.
Corruption can have no place in the new Ukraine.
Here's a comparison of Shokin's and Lutsenko's career path. While Viktor Shokin has a solid legal education and a long career as an investigator, prosecutor, and then deputy prosecutor general, Yuri Lutsenko is an electronic engineer who became a ministerial scientific advisor, then Minister of the Interior thanks to his activism during the Orange Revolution of 2004, before being imprisoned for acts of corruption. Hence, It was necessary to amend Ukrainian law so that corrupt Lutsenko could be nominated Prosecutor General without having any legal background nor experience. His inaugural speech to the parliament was very well-meaning, though.
Мені дуже неприємно, що через мене було внесено поправку в діючий закон про прокуратуру. Я безумовно вважаю, що це не зовсім правильна практика, і ніколи б на це не пішов, якби зміг знайти людину, в яку повірив би президент, парламенту, суспільства, що він може зламати нинішню неефективну, а часто злочинну систему і має більше бажання це зробити, ніж я.
But then, what were the results of this odd prosecutor general? On the 7th of July 2016, Lutsenko held a press conference in order to reveal a scheme through which Burisma managed to evade taxes.
Доброго дня. Почалася операція по виявленню ще одного схеми розкрадання газу. Директор буде відповідати за свої вчинки. Схема складалася з того, що компанія «Еско Північ», яку заснувала Бурісма, через ряд фіктивних підприємств виводила свої прибутки у фіктивні витрати, чим уникала від сплати податку на прибуток. Ще раз повторюся, загальна сума несплати – $1 мільярд гривень за 2 останніх роки.
Yes, you heard right. Burisma was charged with tax fraud for an estimated amount of $40 million. Yet, how much money did Lutsenko ask for this tax adjustment?
Стосовно Злочевського, я абсолютно спокійно дивлюся в очі вам і суспільству. Експертиза нарахувала 160 мільйонів гривень податків. Всі 160 мільйонів гривень через тиждень після виходу експертизи були сплачені в бюджет.
Excuse me? $40 million were embezzled and only $7 million to be paid to close the case? Okay, Lutsenko was clueless when it came to the law, but him being an engineer, we could have expected him to at least be more competent with numbers. Therefore, a simple question arises. But how do Ukrainian anti-corruption associations judge Lutsenko's records on Burisma and Zlochevsky? Let's listen to the testimony of Anastasia Krasnosilskaya, expert at the Anti-Corruption Action Center.
As for economic crimes of Yanukovych, the ones that are connected with allegedly embezzlement of public funds, none of these cases has been submitted to the court. Not even one. Well, basically what we see is that Prosecutor's General Office is not investigating these cases in a due way. Well, there have been a criminal case against Zlochevsky about allegedly illicit enrichment. However, Prosecutor's General Office changed legal qualification of this case for a tax crime for which not even Zlochevsky, but a legal entity connected to him paid a small amount of money, and the case has been closed, with no opportunity to bring Zlochevsky personally to legal liability for illicit enrichment, with no opportunity to recover $23 million.
And here is what Daria Kaleniuk has to say. She's the director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine.
Проблема в тому, що це провадження, яке порушили в Великобританії, не розслідувалося нормально, професійно, незалежно українською прокуратурою. Воно зливалося дуже системно, професійно, з урахуванням різних, напевно, що політичних переговорів. Очевидний факт, що прокуратура злила справу проти Злочевського. Очевидний факт, що прокуратура злила справу проти Бурізми. Очевидний факт, що прокуратура не дослідила до кінця, як Злочевський видавав сам собі ліцензії.
But then, what does Lutsenko think of his own track record on Burisma?
Company Burisma is a great company with 3 main cases. So the first case about non-paying taxes, we have finished this case. They have paid money, and according to Ukrainian law, maybe it is crazy for you or for American, but according to Ukrainian law, when they have paid money, they are free. The case was closed. I am sure that it was legal and successful for Ukrainian budget.
So, the definition of a success for Yuri Lutsenko is this.
Ще раз повторюся, загальна сума несплати – 1 мільярд гривень.
Експертиза нарахувала 160 мільйонів гривень податків.
Great success! The integrity of Yuri Lutsenko thus raises serious questions, and it is not surprising to hear the words of the Ukrainian finance minister who said this in 2017.
Державним банком «Приватбанк» було ініційовано порушення 5 кримінальних справ, що наразі розслідуються Генеральною прокуратурою України. Однак жодна з цих справ на сьогоднішній день не була передана на розгляд судів, оскільки досудові розслідування у даних провадженнях просуваються вкрай повільно, а в деяких справах слідчі дії взагалі не ведуться. Я вимагаю відставки Генерального прокурора Юрія Луценка.
It should also be noted that prosecutor Lutsenko is mentioned in the report of the whistleblower who exposed Ukraine-gate. This CIA officer states that Lutsenko was widely criticized in Ukraine for protecting corrupt Ukrainian leaders. Also, the Anti-Corruption Action Center is making a catastrophic assessment of prosecutor Lutsenko's action.
What are his major successes?
Well, unfortunately, we do not see any major successes of Prosecutor General Mr. Lutsenko.
What about minor successes?
Neither we see his minor successes, because if we try to remember his promises that he made when he was appointed as Prosecutor General and compare them to what has actually been done, we see that nothing has been done.
It should also be noted that the lack of professional integrity is not the only problem with Lutsenko. His personal life has also been the subject of several scandals.
А вы знаете, что вот когда мы начали изучать игорный бизнес сегодняшний, нелегальный, кто бенефициары основные в этом бизнесе? Юрий Луценко, акционер сети подпольных казино.
Державне бюро розслідувань зареєструвало кримінальне провадження проти екс-генпрокурора Юрія Луценка. Справу порушено начебто через зловживання службовим становищем шляхом сприяння незаконному гральному бізнесу.
Щонайменше 50 тисяч євро вартував тижневий відпочинок родини генерального прокурора Юрія Луценка на Сейшельських островах на початку січня. Він разом з родиною зупинився на 8 ночей в одному з найдорожчих готелів Сейшел.
І виклав у соцмережу довідку про те, яким є рівень його зарплатні. Його родина сукупно витратила на тижневу відпустку на Сейшелах більше 50 тисяч євро.
При цьому я вважаю, що відпочинок не був жодною надмірністю, вкладається в те, що собі дозволяє середній клас.
Let's mention that a few months after this story, the European Court of Human Rights has ordered Yuri Lutsenko to stop trying to gain access to journalist Natalia Zetlecka's sources. Generally speaking, Yuri Lutsenko's estate and standards of living raise many questions. Let's mention, for example, that his wife and himself live in a 9,246 square feet house. Another oddity, the couple's reported financial assets have experienced a surprising growth over the last few years. This stems from Mrs. Lutsenko's particularity, who has for the last 4 years owned from $260,000 to $300,000 in cash. In cash! Let's specify that Irina Lutsenko also is a member of parliament and that her financial estate has considerably increased in 2014. In April 2017, while her husband was Prosecutor General, she was designated by President Poroshenko as our official representative in parliament. Still, Mrs. Lutsenko's estate looks pale when compared to the $61 million resting on the oligarch president's bank account.
Президент України Петро Порошенко є гарантом нульової толерантності до корупції.
Yuri Lutsenko's dishonesty quickly became a shared certainty. One example is a testimony before the Congress from American diplomat Kurt Volker, according to whom Lutsenko does not deserve a gram of trust. But it was mainly anti-corruption associations that largely denounced this unworthy prosecutor. All this explains why in May 2019, 20 Ukrainian NGOs, including Transparency International Ukraine, called for personal sanctions against Yuri Lutsenko under the Global Magnitsky Act. The facts against him are serious, ranging from a lack of commitment in the investigations on attacks against anti-corruption activists to obstruction of justice and pure corruption. But to date, the United States has not yet put in place sanctions against Lutsenko. The most surprising thing about all this is that Ukraine not being completely dysfunctional, justice has not remained inactive against Yuri Lutsenko. It should also be noted that several investigations were opened against Yuri Lutsenko when he was Prosecutor General on suspicions of abuse of power and corruption, and since his departure last summer, the accusations have accelerated. Criminal investigations into him? For Prosecutor Lutsenko, all this is perfectly normal.
Якщо не помиляюся, вже 5 чи 6, може й більше, кримінальних проваджень, які мають стосунок до мене. Ненормальним, звичайно, є ажіотаж навколо цього.
When former Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili came up to help Ukraine in its fight against corruption as governor of the region of Odessa, he did not mince his words about Prosecutor Lutsenko's behavior.
Луценко был бизнесменом. За 3 месяца до того, как он ушел в отставку, он продал свои акции табачной индустрии Украины за $70 миллионов, чтобы вы понимали. Это был барыга классический, он называл себя генеральным прокурором. Но, например, есть история, значит, есть парк такой, парк Горького у нас в Одессе. И там супружеская пара там Качановых, они там у них, они арендуют часть парка, они обратились к брату Луценко, потому что Луценко был генеральным прокурором. Что этот брат сделал? Он говорит, я передам все генеральному прокурору, он вам все сделает. После этого этот брат заявляется, говорит, дайте мне 50% вашего бизнеса.
Yuri Lutsenko is a filthy creature who used to close corruption cases for dough. I consider that if he doesn't end up rotting in jail, it will be a very alarming signal. With hindsight, it is quite tasty to listen again to the statements of Lutsenko, who on the day of his appointment made fun of people with legal expertise.
Тим, хто розказує про освіту і необхідність юридичної освіти на посаді генпрокурора, хочу нагадати. Дорога моя Юлія Володимирівна, нас з вами посадили професіонали з юридичною освітою.
So now you know Prosecutor Lutsenko better, whom Joe Biden helped to establish after several months of blackmail to get Shokin fired. To wrap up, we therefore asked several witnesses for their opinions on Yuri Lutsenko. Let's start with journalist and writer Pierre Laurent, specializing in Ukraine, author of A History of this Country, which has been praised by critics.
Que pensez-vous de Yuri Lutsenko?
Yuri Lutsenko, je pense que comme procureur général, il n'est vraiment pas à sa place, parce que c'est quelqu'un qui visiblement a eu suffisamment de problèmes avec la justice pour qu'il soit exclu d'office de ce genre de poste. S'il est devenu procureur général, c'était parce que c'était celui sur lequel certainement on avait le plus de moyens de pression, ce qui n'était pas le cas de Shokin.
Donc pour vous, quel est le pire des deux procureurs entre Lutsenko et Shokin?
Indiscutablement, c'est Lutsenko.
Let's continue with Daria Kaleniuk, director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine, who has found the right words to talk about Lutsenko.
What do you think of Mr. Lutsenko?
Yuri Lutsenko is a crook, and there are many reasons for that. He was abusing his office for his personal interests. Yuri Lutsenko is a big shame for Ukraine. He was appointed as a prosecutor general without even having law degree, and he treated his agency as his personal PR service. He treated prosecutor general office as his personal political platform. We didn't like that. We criticized him heavily. He was intimidating reformers. He was undermining the anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, and he was dumping a lot of important criminal investigations. Sometimes he was even closing important investigations. And I believe that he abused his office also for his self-enrichment. So therefore, I think that Yuri Lutsenko is a crook.
Let's continue with David Sakvarelidze, former Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine for the period 2015-2016.
What is your opinion on Mr. Lutsenko?
Lutsenko is a crook. He's a political crook. He's an individual who does not have any moral values.
or principles. He worked in a couple of political teams, and he used to jump from the one to another. He betrayed a lot of political leaders in this country, and this is a well-known fact. And the most disappointing and sad thing is that he betrayed 2 Maidans in Ukraine already, being in the leadership of Maidan and betraying it, because 2 times he became the part of the corrupted system against which the Maidan actually was. So this is not a person who has any moral right or a background or a trust in this country that he can actually talk about any sort of corruption or any sort of justice. This is not the one who should talk about this.
Do you think he's a corrupted person?
I'm sure 100% that he's a corrupted person.
For you, which is the worst prosecutor?
I think worst is Lutsenko.
Let's finish with Oleg Bazaluk, who is a professor of political philosophy at the universities of Kiev and Maoming in China, a political analyst and writer specialized in the corruption in his country.
Если американцы настояли, чтобы убрать Шокина, лишь бы кто-то другой, который бы не занимался расследованием бурштина вот этой фирмы. И Порошенко предложил кандидатуру Луценко. И она устроила на тот момент американцев, потому что Луценко был круг, да, мошенник, и им легко управлять было. И поэтому он стал, и он не мешал Порошенко и его окружению. И те воровали, он воровал, а никого не садил. Вот и все. Луценко не подходил даже для должности прокурора, у него не было образования. Для того, чтобы Луценко стал прокурором, Порошенко заплатил.
Et pour vous, le procureur Shokin enquêtait normalement sur Burisma?
Да. Да.
Pourquoi Yuri Lutsenko a-t-il passé plusieurs années en prison?
Чтобы вы понимали, вся карьера Луценко, она строилась на предательстве. Поэтому Луценко за это, он действительно коррупционер, и на момент его ареста там его состояние тоже оценивалось там больше, чем 10-20 миллионов долларов. Вот против него уже возбуждено 2 уголовных дела у нас в Украине, потому что действительно они очень сейчас богаты, они тоже очень много украли за время правления. И поэтому я не удивлюсь, если его снова посадят. Поэтому это характеристика Луценко. Он вор, он коррупционер, и он предатель. И его не любят. И в Украине его не любят, и в среде, потому что я много общаюсь с политиками. Его никто не любит, но он обладает большим компроматом на людей. И поэтому его как бы терпят.
То есть он еще этими компроматами он держит хорошую власть.
Конечно, он же даже с американцами.
Donc, monsieur Lutsenko était pire que monsieur Shokin.
Шокин был профессионалом. Шокин всю жизнь провел в прокуратуре. Он карьеру сделал в прокуратуре. А Луценко, у него нет юридического образования. Это просто было политическое назначение. Луценко вообще не понимал ничего в прокуратуре.
Est-ce qu'il pense que Yuri Lutsenko était un escroc, oui ou non?
Да, я могу сказать, что Луценко вор.
All these analyses are therefore overwhelming for Lutsenko. Finally, it should be noted that this was also made clear during the hearings at the Congress.
What was the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine's view of Prosecutor General Lutsenko?
He was using his office to insulate and protect political allies while presumably enriching himself.
Is another way to describe that corrupt?
Yes.
Thus, our investigation and its many powerful testimonies prove that Joe Biden lied brazenly, and therefore misled many people about Lutsenko's qualities when he said this.
And they put in place someone who was solid.
Today we will analyze Joe Biden's line of defense, set up by his communication consultants. You will see that this narrative has not only been widely repeated by many American media without any verification, but it has also been contested by the principal concerned, the former Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin, in various interviews, of which we will reveal some extracts that have never been broadcast. Let us note in passing that the Democrats' accusations against Trump are related to a type of behavior that is very similar to what Joe Biden displayed in this case. Considering that Burisma, the company administered by his son, was under an investigation opened by prosecutor Shokin's office, the conflict of interest might seem obvious. However, Joe Biden's advisors, to save him, created a narrative that would then be adopted by the media. According to this narrative, prosecutor Shokin would have deliberately stopped all investigations against Burisma. Consequently, Joe Biden would have acted as a sane guy by asking for his resignation, which prevented the investigations from being kept under the rug. And when I'm talking about this sane guy narrative, this is no exaggeration. Let's listen to what Joe Biden's advisor immediately declared at the time of the events.
Initially, Lutsenko actually reopens the case against Burisma. The vice president was acting against that interest because Shokin wasn't investigating Burisma, and replacing Shokin with anybody who was more interested in anti-corruption actually increased the risk that the Burisma case would be reopened. I think then a court dismisses it in the fall of 2016. Some of our hopes about Lutsenko being kind of a non-politicized reformer were kind of dashed by what happened afterwards. Yeah.
Lutsenko being non-politicized and interested in anti-corruption? The bigger the lie is, the more it will be believed. However, it's true that determining whether or not Burisma investigations under Shokin were actually proceeding is essential to the Ukraine gate. Therefore, we will analyze the media's narrative on this point. We thus realize that the narrative over the Burisma investigations being dormant has been overwhelmingly put forward by the press ever since the beginning of the scandal at the end of September 2019. Or here too, from the Washington Post. It must be understood that this argument of the dormant investigations is central to Joe Biden's defense. Indeed, aside from the interference, of what can we accuse him if the investigations of the prosecutor he got fired did not actually threaten Burisma? Nothing at all. And it is precisely this argument used to exonerate Biden that has been hammered everywhere by the press. Let us look at the example of the Washington Post, which particularly distinguished itself by its pro-Biden bias. In this article, not only the journalist fails to criticize Biden's despicable blackmail on Ukraine, but in a very complacent way, he virtually congratulates Biden for having managed to squeeze months of diplomacy into a few hours. We can legitimately wonder whether words such as lie, deception, or mythomania wouldn't have rather been used if Trump had done the exact same thing. Even worse here, not only does the journalist take up the narrative of the investigations being stalled, but she also states that Burisma was only investigated for a period of time prior to Hunter's hiring in the company. Yet, as the Prosecutor General's website still states to this date, the Burisma Group is guilty of tax fraud for the 2014 and 2015 fiscal years, when Hunter officiated as administrator. Moreover, the Burisma company once again committed fraud in 2016. We don't have any information regarding the 2017-2019 period, but anything is possible. Here the fact-checker states that the American ambassador Payet would have publicly criticized Shokin's office for having undermined the recovery of Zlochevsky $23 million by London. But we have already seen that this case actually occurred in 2014 and thus falls under the responsibility of Shokin's predecessor. The case had actually contributed to his resignation and thus to the eventual arrival of Shokin. Finally, even worse, the Washington Post went as far as lying to smear Shokin's name. Have a look at this excerpt from an article dating from the 2nd of October, by the way titled, "Correcting the Media's Mistake." The journalist writes that on the 24th of September 2015, the American ambassador criticized Shokin in one of his speeches by accusing him to have sabotaged reforms and the work of honest prosecutors. This information actually totally discredits Shokin, and it is even surprising that an ambassador could have held such words against an officiating prosecutor general. Let us fact-check the fact-checker. This will be easy. We have recovered the video of the speech. Listen.
Corrupt actors within the Prosecutor General's office are making things worse by openly and aggressively undermining reform. We have learned that there have been times that the PGO not only did not support investigations into corruption, but rather undermined prosecutors working on legitimate prosecution cases. For example, in the case of former Ecology Minister Mykola Zlochevsky, UK authorities seized $23 million in illicit assets.
It is clear here that the ambassador mentions corrupt elements inside of the prosecutor's office, but he never directly points at the prosecutor general himself. In fact, do you know how many prosecutors and investigators officiated under the orders of Shokin? Although the figure might seem unbelievable, it is true. 11,300 prosecutors and investigators, to which must be added 3,700 other employees. And that's not all. This article from The Independent indicates that 70 to 80% of their work was not honest. It then becomes clear that this represented a lot of corrupt elements for Shokin to manage by himself, and he was not going to perform miracles in the span of a few weeks. Hence, the ambassador's accusation did not directly target Shokin, unlike what the Washington Post would make us believe. This is even undeniable, considering how Payat ended his speech.
The United States wants to work with Prosecutor General Shokin, so the PGO is leading the fight against corruption.
Thus, as we can see, there is a complete mystification of Ambassador Payat's words, which never directly targeted Shokin. These issues of journalistic integrity show how our case study on the Washington Post is relevant to analyze diffusion of this narrative around the Burisma investigations which been dormant. Therefore, we have decided to analyze all publications pertaining in the first months of the scandal, starting from September the 23rd. Here are every occurrences of the Washington Post hammering down this pro-Biden narrative. We realize that this anti-Shokin argument was hammered down at least 20 times during the first 4 days. And that in articles authored by around 15 different journalists. But this trend did not stop, on the contrary. We find traces of the anti-Shokin narrative in 19 other articles from the sole Washington Post, with numerous and different writers who all use the same copy-paste sentence. And it's still not over. Here is another 15 articles, all reproductions of the exact same narrative. Shokin swept the Burisma investigations dormant. On the whole, this pro-Biden narrative was reused 52 times in 31 days in the Washington Post alone, as this chart shows. However, this narrative does have a source. It originates from a declaration reported on the 7th of May by Bloomberg, and its author is Vitaly Kasko, one of Shokin's deputy prosecutors. This is obviously a statement that must be taken into consideration, but in Ukraine, unfortunately, one needs to stay very cautious regarding official declarations. For example, Bloomberg forgets to mention the long conflict between Mr. Kasko and Mr. Shokin, and that eventually pushed Mr. Kasko to resign. Furthermore, on May the 6th of 2019, Shokin claimed on a Ukrainian website that Kasko had at the time joined the Biden clan, because he had been promised the position of Prosecutor General. In short, as it's often the case in Ukraine, things are very complicated, and one must avoid black and white analyses. There are many shades of grey. So in order to know whether or not Burisma investigation was indeed dormant, we have decided to rely as much as possible on facts, and here are the ones we can find fairly easily on the progress of the Zlochevsky cases during the short mandate of Shokin, who started in February 2015. On the 16th of June 2015, Viktor Shokin launched an investigation against Burisma over the attribution of gas extraction licenses during the time when Zlochevsky occupied a minister position. On the 25th of June, Shokin launched an investigation to find Zlochevsky accomplices in the prosecutor's office, in the $23 million case. On the 10th of July, the Prosecutor's Bureau published a press statement in the wake of Shokin and American Ambassador Payat's meeting. We can notice that the press release states that Shokin had informed the ambassador of the investigation's progress on Zlochevsky, and in particular the intensification of cooperation with the British in this direction. On the 31st of July, the prosecutor's office seized one of Zlochevsky's estates. On the 19th of October, a press dispatch indicated that Shokin had complained about the British justice on freezing Zlochevsky's assets, and that he had launched a joint investigation unit with the British, who had accepted to cooperate. He specified having been invited by the British to a Eurojust coordination meeting, the Justice European Interpol, dedicated to the Zlochevsky case. Following an internal investigation, on December the 1st, a lawsuit was launched at the Prosecutor General's office request against the employee who signed the letter that had allowed Zlochevsky to recover his $23 million. On the 15th of December, the specialized anti-corruption prosecutor was charged with taking the lead in the investigation over the gas licenses attribution cases. On the 21st of December, the file was handed over to the Anti-Corruption Bureau to be investigated. And finally, on the 4th of February 2016, Ukrainian justice ordered the seizure of all of Zlochevsky's personal property and real estate in the country. The event was so important that a press dispatch was produced for the occasion. In short, these dormant cases still seem to be pretty active. That being said, the best way to know whether or not Shokin really was investigating might still be to ask him. And so, here are Shokin's main declarations over this year. I attempted to continue the investigations, but on or around June or July of 2015, the US ambassador, Geoffrey R. Pyatt, told me that the investigation had to be handled with white gloves, which implied to do nothing. I was investigating Mykola Zlochevsky, the founder of Burisma. Hunter Biden was appointed to the board of the firm, which was an appointment made by Zlochevsky in order to protect himself. Biden landed here a group of such managers who are personally indebted to him and depend on him. Everybody knew about that. Concerning Zlochevsky, there were hints. After all, his company at that time was very famous. And everyone understood that he didn't take such people to his board of directors for no reason. The US ambassador Pyatt talked to me about the cases against Zlochevsky. All the problems happened because I didn't understand the hints to stop the investigation on abuses by Burisma. At first I was gently prompted and led to it. There were many such approaches. All subsequent events are a consequence of my refusal. We even planned to interrogate Hunter Biden, Devon Archer, but we didn't have time. President Poroshenko told me several times that Biden demanded my dismissal. Biden took this very seriously. He promised Poroshenko to bring a compromat proving my corruption. As Poroshenko said, he brought fuck all. If the vice president of the USA had evidence of my corruption, he would have used it in his interests. All criminal cases against Burisma and Zlochevsky were illegally dropped under Lutsenko's supervision. Joe Biden claims that my declarations are false, and yet all my words are nothing but truth. I had explained this in an interview for the American television network ABC, but this section was never broadcast on television. Just like most segments of our conversation, which lasted almost 2 hours. Yes, you heard it right. Shokin was interviewed by ABC News, which cut off most of the interview, and apparently didn't make it available on their website afterwards. We have contacted over the issue more than 20 times the 3 ABC's journalists to get more explanations, without ever getting an answer. But the most interesting thing is that Shokin, who apparently doesn't really trust American media outlets, had asked his assistant to record the interview with his phone. And so here are the notorious interviews highlights, which apparently never appeared on ABC News. What do you think about Joe Biden's statements?
Повторяю еще раз, и акцентирую на это внимание. Джо Байден никогда формально не сделал ни о моей работе, ни о моей личности, ни о моей коррупции, ни о чем. Я повторяю, что если бы, я в этом уверен, обладая такими широчайшими возможностями вице-президент США, имел какие-то либо доказательства моих каких-то неправильностей, он бы давно это сказал формально для всех.
Were you investigating on Burisma?
Взял документ, сколько было уголовных дел в отношении Бурисма и Злочевского.
Here is a document showing how many investigations there were regarding Mr. Zlochevsky and Burisma.
Вот. Раз, два, три, четыре, пять.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, did you get that? You want to do it again?
Yeah,
Let me have close up.
Mr. Shokin, can you do that again? А можете, пожалуйста,
Показать еще раз, пожалуйста.
пальцем пересчитать, вот как только, как вы сделали.
Пожалуйста.
You're saying there were 6 investigations against Burisma.
Да. И что получилось? Почему он сейчас не расстрел? Я объясню. Потому что генеральный прокурор Луценко 2015 года, да, и я думаю, что было очевидно, что мы придем к тому моменту, когда начнем проводить следственные действия и с Хантером Байденом, и с Косневским, и с другими нанятыми представителями, которые имели влияние в тот период в США.
What did you think when Joe Biden insulted you?
Ну, давайте к истории. Дело в том, что это все он сказал уже намного позже, когда меня уволили. Когда шла речь кулуарно у него с президентом, с Порошенко, еще с кем-то, нигде, повторяю еще раз, а формально, официально он это не заявлял. Он это заявил через полгода. Мне сложно оценить его моральное качество, потому что я уже дал по поводу своего интервью. Это человек, который может говорить, который мира, не уважает матерей, которые родили и его в том числе.
It's pretty fun to find that same journalist of ABC in the process of asking questions to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, who does not really want to lie to please the journalists.
President Trump asked you to investigate Joe Biden. Is that why the new prosecutor general is reviewing the Burisma case?
And we have many criminal problems, so okay.
So to be clear, though, you did that because President Trump asked you to review the Burisma. You're against corruption, so I'm curious. What do you think of a president asking a foreign nation to investigate a political rival? Is that corrupt?
I think that this is not corruption because it was just called.
Do you think it's corrupt if a president asks a foreign nation to investigate his political rival?
Тому що якщо я, як президент України, буду коментувати згідно законодавства розмову пана Трампа, а значить це буде втручання в ваш виборчий процес.
But do you think President Trump was corrupt to ask you? Do you think President Trump was corrupt in asking you?
Я не відчував тиск і вплив.
So to be clear, you don't want to judge him. In English, you don't want to judge President Trump. It's not your place, is what you're saying.
Дивіться, я не дам вам можливості змінювати мою позицію. Я не хочу коментувати законність дій президента будь-якої іншої країни.
But the bad faith of some journalists can go even further, like here on CNN. Quite a character, this Zelensky, who answers the questions we ask him.
His answer was evasive, relying on semantics. Did you feel pressure from President Trump to investigate the Bidens in order to unfreeze military aid?
I understood. I'd like to tell you that I never feel pressure. And I'd like to think, and my actions suggest, no one can put pressure on me.
Now you hear there, he says, no one can pressure me, Jake. That's different from saying no one did pressure me.
We let everyone form an opinion regarding the argument, repeated time and time again, that Shokin was not investigating Burisma, and whether or not arguing the opposite would qualify as a conspiracy theory. Let us further develop our analysis with an important information. When the Ukrainian justice ordered the seizure of Zlochevsky's assets, coincidentally, Joe Biden intensified his pressure on Shokin only a few days after this event. As we can see here. Thus we learned that Biden called Poroshenko no less than 4 times in 8 days. In order to reassert his position, there would be no money as long as Shokin remains in office. Poroshenko then gave in, and on the 16th of February, he asked Shokin to write his resignation letter, which the prosecutor did 3 days later. At this point, we do not claim anything more. It must be kept in mind that coincidences happen. But clearly, the events here are serious enough to deserve a thorough investigation, and not a simple copy-paste from media outlets relying on questionable and unchecked information. What's important to understand now is what happened exactly after Shokin's resignation in order to secure the $1 billion guarantee. On the 20th of February, the days after Shokin's resignation, Joe Biden called Poroshenko to express his satisfaction and declared that the prosecutor's replacement paved the way to a reform of the prosecutor's office. On the 1st of April, Obama was still describing the $1 billion loan guarantee as a simple possibility. Apparently, the racket was still going on, which seemed to not make Poroshenko very happy. For once, he was on the wrong side of the fence. On the 14th of April, Biden called Poroshenko to urge him to designate a new prosecutor general that would bolster the agency's anti-corruption efforts. On the 13th of May, Poroshenko designated Lutsenko as new prosecutor general. The next day, he received another call from Joe Biden, who welcomed the appointment of Lutsenko, quote, a first step to bringing much-needed reform. He then announced that the $1 billion guarantee could finally be agreed upon, which was done on the 3rd of June, in the presence of Poroshenko and Ambassador Payat. Hence, Joe Biden obtained what he wanted, albeit not in 6 hours, but in 5 months, the replacement of Shokin with Lutsenko. All these pressures to make Shokin resign are truly astonishing. Not that we claim Mr. Shokin was a perfect prosecutor general, but a more nuanced analysis of his case seems absolutely necessary. Let us look at the way the press presented Shokin's resignation at the time, since he then was of no importance to the American domestic political life. Hence, on the day Shokin resigned, the New York Times unapologetically reminded that he had been criticized for turning a blind eye to corrupt practice of a venal and entrenched elite rooted in the country. But he also emphasizes that he played an important role in balancing competing political interests, thus helping maintain stability during a treacherous era. This same newspaper reasserted at the beginning of the year that knowing whether or not Shokin was indeed conducting a legitimate investigation against Burisma, or if he tried instead to get a bribe, aroused considerable debate among Ukrainian and American officials. This is the New York Times. For now, it is hard to know where the truth lays, but an investigation from the Independent will get us closer to it. Here Shokin is described as someone that is dependent, obedient to his bosses and following orders, who tries to avoid scandals, qualities that allowed him to survive in this hostile environment. We then learned that he had been promoted at the beginning of the 2000s thanks to pressures from Poroshenko, but that his employer at the time never had to complain about him, since he was a competent investigator who didn't spare himself in order to successfully find the killers of journalist Georgi Kongadze, murdered in 2000. In conclusion, Shokin is here described as a man who is not bad in itself, but is typical of the Soviet period, when investigators never disturbed the nomenclatura elite. Finally, there is another important information. Apparently, Shokin would not have been no more, no less corrupt than his predecessors. These accounts confirm us in our astonishment over the course of our investigation. A number of witnesses harshly criticized former prosecutor Shokin. Certainly, no one can deny that this one deserves objectively critics. But why such verbal abuse, coming from such high-placed people just a few months after his arrival at the head of a very corrupt institution, where it is difficult to work miracles so fast? What could Shokin have done so badly? Once again, the Independent's investigation will be helpful, because it talks about Burisma. This newspaper explains that the Burisma investigations obey to a well-practiced pattern of corruption in Ukraine. Prosecute an oligarch, seize his assets, and then negotiate a bribe to close the investigation. And the journalist mentions that Poroshenko was at the heart of this extortion scheme. From that moment on, we start to better grasp the magnitude of the scandal. And we understand that the problem isn't so much Shokin, as it is in fact the president and the Ukrainian government. Meanwhile, the Qatari news channel Al Jazeera accurately informs us. The news outlet also confirms the fact that Poroshenko controlled Shokin, who could have never tackled high-level corruption without the approval of the president, which was therefore missing. Yegor Sobolev, the MP heading the Parliamentary Anti-Corruption Commission, even concludes with these words. There isn't enough political will at the parliamentary and presidential levels to establish a real justice. And all these corrupt judges, all these corrupt prosecutors, allow the new president and many members of the parliament to continue corrupt schemes that were established before the revolution. This declaration is truly horrifying. Let us add that a few months later, Poroshenko's party suspended Sobolev from his position, from which he had blocked more than 300 bill projects, including provisions that would facilitate practices of corruption. The worst thing is that Poroshenko's corrupt character has been known to American officials for at least 15 years, and this 2006 diplomatic cable in which the embassy stated that Poroshenko was tainted with credible accusations of corruption. Finally, it should obviously be noted that this information can be found in the American press. However, it is usually very limited and seldom placed on the front cover, something I call the page 27 syndrome. Finding the important information sometimes requires extensive research. Last, let's quote this excellent article from a Reuters blog, explaining that corruption is so bad a Nigerian prince would be embarrassed, and that Poroshenko was determined to maintain control over prosecutors used as a weapon against opponents in business or politics, as we will see. All these elements explain the lack of popularity of Ukraine's political leaders, all perceived as corrupt. So there are only two main hypotheses left. Either Shokin was genuinely working, and so the Burisma investigations were moving forward, either Shokin was not working in an honest manner, because Poroshenko was trying to extort money from Zlochevsky. In order to do so, he would have ordered Shokin to keep investigating, so as to have leverage on the oligarch. So, according to these two hypotheses, the investigations could only be moving forward, indeed more or less rapidly, and facts indeed show that they did make progresses. And so in both cases, Zlochevsky would have certainly been dissatisfied with Shokin. Joe Biden's pressures would have acted in the oligarch's interests. And so the vice president was in a particularly problematic situation of conflict of interests. So this reasoning is certainly only logical. But it turns out that the thorough investigation of a New York Times reporter allows us to confirm this. He says that Mr. Zlochevsky's lawyers were relieved by the dismissal of Mr. Shokin. They claimed that Mr. Shokin used the threat of prosecution to solicit bribes from Mr. Zlochevsky, which left the oligarch's legal team leery of dealing with the prosecutor. We therefore have the confirmation of our analysis and the answer to the fundamental problem. Joe Biden's actions indeed served the interests of the oligarch, whether or not it was done in a deliberate manner. Consequently, this fact requires Joe Biden's actions to be further investigated. But the New York Times article goes even further. We learn that Mr. Zlochevsky's lawyers were pleased by the appointment of Mr. Lutsenko and felt that they could work with him to resolve the oligarch's legal issues. Textually, working with him to solve the legal problems. Obviously knowing that an honest prosecutor does not work to solve the problems of the indicted people, he investigates and pursues them, that's all. And here we read, while Mr. Lutsenko had initially adopted a hard line against Burisma, 10 months after taking office, the company announced that Mr. Lutsenko and the courts had totally closed all judicial proceedings and criminal proceedings pending against Mr. Zlochevsky and his companies. The oligarch, who had fled the country as a result of investigations by previous prosecutors, was removed from the list of people wanted by a Ukrainian court and came back to the country. By the way, Burisma welcomed the decision and their victory in a triumphant press release which announced the end of the prosecutions following the cooperation between the company and the Prosecutor General. This was on the 12th of January 2017, 3 days before Joe Biden's last trip to Kiev and 1 week before Donald Trump's inauguration. Obviously, the Ukrainian anti-corruption associations vigorously protested against the dismissal of the charges, as Transparency International Ukraine and the Anti-Corruption Center did here. Or here again with Anticor, Ukraine's biggest anti-corruption website. And both the front picture and the title illustrate what they thought to be the reasons behind this first-class burial. They bluntly conclude the article by writing that actually Burisma is the only motive of Joe Biden in his love for Ukraine. Because it's obvious for those who know how Ukraine's General Prosecutor's Office works, and we have detailed its functioning earlier, a sudden dropping of criminal charges after an intensification of the investigations almost certainly signaled the payment of a bribe by the prosecuted individual. This is a typical pattern in Ukraine, one of the worst, most corrupt countries. The dropping of the charges is especially surprising to those aware of the incriminating evidences against Mykola Zlochevsky. For example, the sole fraud accusation surrounding the self-attribution of gas licenses had been corroborated by a remarkable investigation from the Wall Street Journal in 2015. As for Yuri Lutsenko, the facts speak for themselves. Remember,
company Burisma is a great company with 3 main cases. So the first case about non-paying taxes, we have finished this case. They have paid money. And according to Ukrainian law, maybe it is crazy for you or for American, but according to Ukrainian law, when they have paid money, they are free. The case was closed. I am sure that it was legal and successful for Ukrainian budget.
Ще раз повторюся, загальна сума несплати – мільярд гривень.
Експертиза нарахувала 160 мільйонів гривень податків.
A great success!
In short, all these elements show that there is around a 95% probability that Zlochevsky indeed paid Poroshenko in order to end the prosecution, since his innocence cannot be completely ruled out. To this point, we have mainly talked about concrete facts, but I would now like to share what is no more than an intuition, completely arguable since I do not have any solid evidence to support it, if not the hours I've spent analyzing Viktor Shokin's actions and interviews. I tend to think that he was saying the truth on the Burisma case, and that at least until the end of 2015, he was genuinely investigating. I obviously take no position regarding the other cases. I have several reasons to think this way. First, the case is extremely sensitive from an international point of view. It is overseen by Eurojust. It directly affects the image of Ukraine's legal authorities, which had already been humiliated by the $23 million episode in London. Then, because there are occasions when Shokin can be very combative. For example, it must be noted that Shokin first contested his dismissal in Ukrainian courts, before bringing his case to the European Court of Human Rights. Does a simply corrupt prosecutor do this? Put himself back into the international spotlight? Because there is one thing that appears very clearly when one carefully listens to him. By and large, Shokin is a patriot, and it is easy to imagine him resisting, as a matter of principle, to the pressures of the highly controversial employer of a foreign leader's son, especially when that leader is trying to get him fired. But most of all, it is the main hypothesis that makes the most sense considering Zlochevsky's lawyer's statements. Why would have they been so critical of Shokin and so happy with Lutsenko's appointment when we know the latter's crookedness? But these are only simple leads to be examined by other future investigations, which might very well come to a different conclusion. And let us state again that, in any case, this issue doesn't change anything about the main point, Joe Biden's involvement. Since the investigations were moving forward, he de facto helped the oligarch, voluntarily or not. But just as in American movies, there's a final twist at the end, someone that rises alone and who helps the truth come to the light. This man is George Kent. He is a civil servant working for the State Department. In 2014-2015, he was the anti-corruption coordinator for Europe, before becoming deputy chief of mission to the American embassy in Kiev. During his closed-door testimony to the Congress on the 15th of October, he revealed a number of elements. Mr. Kent thus said that in February 2015, 9 months after Hunter Biden's appointment, he had shared his concerns over Hunter's presence in Burisma's executive board with the vice president's staff. But he then explains that he was abruptly turned down and that no one was willing to address the topic. Another argument was rehearsed in the media. Biden had not been the only one asking for Prosecutor General Shokin's dismissal. It had in fact been an international movement, which included the IMF and the European Union. Yet Kent explained that the United States were actually the leading voice against Shokin, and that their voices mattered a lot. When asked if the United States had been the first to push for a change of prosecutor, Kent implies it was indeed the case. He indicates that the US were coordinating with the other institutions on this issue, and that the US had greater interests at stake in doing so. Unfortunately, he doesn't specify what were these interests. All these elements seriously weaken Biden's defense. Others were the leading voice against Shokin, but many of them were merely following the United States position. Furthermore, this seems to be corroborated by subsequent developments. Oddly enough, just about all of these institutions allegedly independently concerned with the Shokin issue seem to have mysteriously aligned with the American stance, a surprising complacency towards Lutsenko. Moreover, Kent tells us more about Zlochevsky's methods. During a meeting with one of the deputy prosecutors general, he was told that the $23 million had indeed been unfrozen thanks to a $7 million bribe paid to the prosecutor general's office. Consequently, Kent answered that it would be appropriate to arrest Zlochevsky the next time he came to Ukraine, and that the US were furious about this situation. The whole thing is mind-boggling. While the American embassy is advising the prosecutor general's office to arrest Zlochevsky for corruption, the vice president's son is making a fortune working for him. And to say he was working is already a bit much, but we will come back to this point in another video. For now, let's say he was employed by the oligarch. In short, the whole thing says a lot about what the US were blaming Zlochevsky for, and consequently on the problem of having Hunter Biden putting his father in a situation of conflict of interest. It is thus most welcome that on the 4th of October of 2019, the new prosecutor general announced he would closely be controlling the proper functioning of the 15 investigation concerning Zlochevsky. Moreover, Kent also mentions Burisma, and coyly says that the company does not have a good image in Ukraine because it is known for not competing in public tenders relying on the quality of service. Corruption. Most importantly, Mr. Ken says to have met Yuri Lutsenko in the spring of 2016 to evaluate his reliability. At that moment, it quickly became very clear that he was not any more serious about reforming the prosecutorial service than Shokin had been. And he concludes by saying that Lutsenko was simply another corrupt prosecutor general. This is obviously a very important point. It would be necessary for the Congress Investigation Commission to look at the assessments of Lutsenko, performed by the Kiev embassy, and their dates, bearing in mind that the embassy was inevitably consulted regarding the new prosecutor. If the embassy has indicated that he would be better than Shokin, it would be necessary to understand how they could have said such an enormity. But if the embassy maintained his final stance, which was one of mere common sense, about Lutsenko being a bad choice, Joe Biden would then have to justify why he did not oppose his appointment, or at the very least, asked for his dismissal. Because Kent indeed states that the US never asked for Lutsenko's removal, and that they were never as concerned with him as they had been with Shokin. But why? To sum up, Kent declares that Shokin had been more troublesome for the American government in 10 months than Lutsenko was in 3 years. And Kent also notes that the embassy quickly realized he would not be a better prosecutor than Shokin. We always fall back to the same questions. Why didn't Biden continue his blackmail so that Lutsenko's appointment be rescinded? Why did he ignore the assessments the embassy made of him? And most importantly, what did Shokin do to Biden to make him react so passionately? What were those interests Shokin was threatening? Couldn't it be because he was truly investigating Burisma? Finally, if Biden's demand that Shokin be removed was truly motivated by the fight against corruption, Poroshenko humiliated him by replacing him with someone that was much worse. From then, it is surprising to see him spontaneously mention the episode in public, with plenty of detail. He did so laughing, showing himself in the best light, exaggerating, lying. Humiliated people don't act like this. They'd rather pass under silence the scathing failure. But everything happens as if Joe Biden was not humiliated, and that the replacement of Shokin by Lutsenko delighted him. Is it because a few months later, Lutsenko was going to totally whiten Zolochevsky?
You also have a battle, a historic battle against corruption. But I can tell you, you cannot name me a single democracy in the world where the cancer of corruption is prevalent. You cannot name me one. They are thoroughly inconsistent.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. I hope you found it interesting and that you have learned a lot about Ukraine-gate. In the next video, you will see our exclusive interviews which confirm our analysis. You will better understand the backstage of this matter. Our investigation all began in the spring of 2019. It is a result of many months of work, but also of several years of rigorous analysis of the situation in Ukraine. All our work has been done completely independently. We are only supported by our readers. No advertising, no subsidies, no shareholders. If you are interested in our content and would like to allow us to continue our investigative work on Ukraine-gate, then please do not hesitate to support us. The easiest way is, of course, to subscribe to our Twitter and Facebook accounts, on which we will publish in both French and English on this topic. But you can also support us by making a donation to our association. All you have to do is access this address. All your donations will be used to continue our investigations and will allow us to pay our investigators and technicians. So a big thank you in advance to all those who will help us to continue this work. We really need you. If you wish to contact us or if you have specific skills, here is our email address. In particular, we are looking for lawyers, auditors, and investigators to help us analyze the nebula of companies created by Zolochevsky to conceal his activities in tax havens. Finally, if you would like to send us information or testimonies related to Ukraine-gate, please use this other email address. Thanks again and see you soon for our next video.